This week, students, we'll move to the postcranial skeleton. Right, we started off with our knowledge beginning through the skeleton, starting with skulls and our teeth. Now we'll move to everything but the cranium, and that's known as the postcrania or the postcranial skeleton. Postcranial skeleton, of course, includes everything else. That includes the vertebral column, the thorax, and the pelvic girdles. That's, the kind of the area of your chest, as well as your upper limbs that are connected to it, and then your pelvic girdle with your lower limbs that are connected. So oftentimes you will see osteologists do that. Remember that I informed you that the skull is a real busy place because it has 28 bones, including the 3 bones in each one of your inner ears. And it has all sorts of landmarks. It's responsible for how you breathe, how you chew and eat and swallow. It houses the brain. And so, as I said, it's just a lot going on. And then you have the postcranial skeleton, which isn't, not as important, but the bones are larger. They're pieces. They don't have as many landmarks to look at or foramina, right? Holes in the bones. And at that point, it's really about being able to identify them. I'm going to show you complete bones, but be aware that oftentimes our osteologists, we don't get the nice complete bones. You do mostly in forensics. However, if there is injury, if there's mutilation, if there's something that's done after death, which is known as post-mortem, where maybe the bones have been crushed or burned or modified in some way, you're not going to have complete bones, and that's when you have to rely on a number of your landmarks. But we'll move through the postcranial skeleton in these ways. We'll start with the axial skeleton, and then to the thorax, including the upper limbs, the pelvic girdle, and then the lower limbs. Let's start with the vertebral column. The vertebral column is made up of different types of vertebrae. Vertebra is singular, vertebrae is plural. And so we can divide the vertebral column up into 5 parts. This includes the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal vertebrae. Your cervical vertebrae, those are the ones that are part of your neck. And the root word in Latin is cervix. And cervix just means neck. And so that's one way to remember that they are part of the vertebral column that houses a number of different nerves and, of course, is connected to your skull or your cranium. Your thoracic vertebrae, they are part of the thorax, and there are 12 of them. This one is easy to remember because there are 12 ribs, and there is a rib attached to each one of them, and it's part of the thorax, which is the technical term for chest or the chest cavity. Lumbar vertebrae, there are typically 5. Some people have 4, some people have 6. So understand there is slight variation in some of these places that we know, even in humans and other organisms. The lumbar vertebrae are the largest ones, and they form the base of your lower back. Your sacral or sacral vertebrae, they actually do begin in ontogeny as you're growing and developing as separate pieces, and then they will fuse together to form the sacrum. And then there are between 3 and 5 coccygeal vertebrae, or what is also known as your coccyx, and they will oftentimes fuse together. This is oftentimes known as your vestigial tail. And this is important because the coccygeal vertebrae, or the coccyx, they are attached to a number of different muscles that help you defecate. Now, if we go through each one of these sections or segments, each one has special indicators where you can identify them matter-of-factly individually, even just one or even a fragment, if you know some of the details about each one of them. You'll also notice that humans, because we walk upright on two limbs, bipedal, we have S-shaped spines. Organisms that are more forward, like a chimpanzee or other apes, they have S-shaped spines. They have C-shaped spines. Humans have S-shaped spines. Chimpanzee, gorilla, orangutan, they have C-shaped spines. They're not all the way down, right? You also notice that a dog or a cat, they have somewhat C-shaped spines, but it's not as pronounced or prominent because they're completely on all fours and completely forward. But because when you look at the apes, their arms are longer than their legs. When they're on the ground, they're forced to be a little more upright, and that gives us that more pronounced C-shaped spine. But because we are upright and that most of our body weight, probably about 50% or more, is floating above our pelvis, then what necessitates are two places for what are known as kyphoses and lordoses. You don't need to know this, but I'm telling you. These are places where the S-shaped spine is formed, where lordosis means there are two spots where your spine actually has an anterior projection. A kyphosis is known as a spot where you have posterior projection. And these posterior projections are at or around, like your neck and your chest cavity, as well as near your lumbar vertebrae and your sacrum. And then you have places where you have lordoses, which are anterior projection, both at around your neck, as well as the same spot at parts of your lower back. These are so that you can hold the weight of your head and hold the weight of your chest cavity. They're necessary in terms of the spine because we walk on two legs. Let's observe the typical anatomy of a vertebra. And so if you look at both how they're formed, those ossification centers in growth and development, they are also good indicators of the anatomy of a vertebra. And if you look at some of these components, you have the body, and this is where most of the weight is distributed for you to hold your head, as well as your thorax and chest cavity. There is also an arch, and these are, articulation centers that connect to the body and then eventually form parts of the spine. And of course, the spine area you can feel when you reach in the back of your neck or along the midline of your back. You can feel the areas where there's cartilage connected to your bony spine of your vertebrae. You also have articulation centers along the arch, but you have extra articulation centers that are on thoracic vertebrae. And matter of fact, these two aspects are of a thoracic vertebra. And you can even see articulation centers that kind of are splayed off the arch and the spine, as well as there are articulation centers on both lateral sides of the vertebral body, right? One that's superior and one that's inferior on each lateral side. These articulation centers are there because this is a thoracic vertebrae. It actually articulates with your ribs and your rib cage, the thorax. This is essential. I have even identified a thoracic vertebra, a very, very small fragment of the lateral portion that had one of those articulation centers. And I remember working on an archaeological site and seeing it and telling the field crew, because I was the human bone expert there, and I told them, no, this is a human bone. And I had to convince them, eventually show them why. And I knew that it had the facets or articulation areas that were indicative of a human thoracic vertebrae. And I think I remember I talked to the crew chief, and the crew chief said, well, the place where we were surveying, he mentioned that it was like a $50,000 decision because we would have to charge the developer to allow us to investigate and dig in that area. And eventually we did. We found 3 graves that were thousands of years old. So not only the bioarchaeologist, right, the human bone expert on archaeological sites, but also the forensic anthropologist needs to know these landmarks, not just so you can understand them on whole bones, but you're going to see fragments of bones. One of the first forensic cases I ever worked on when I was living in Arkansas was a case where an individual was burned. And then after that individual was burned, they took the bones and looked like they smashed them with a hammer. And so we were left with tiny fragments of bones. And some of these articulation centers are crucial, or will be crucial, to identifying the bones that are in the assemblage that is recovered from a crime scene, as well as trying to then eventually move towards human identification, as well as redress or justice for the person who committed that crime. On this slide, we'll go over a number of landmarks and features that we see on different vertebral segments. So I've divided some of them up: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacrum, coccyx, or coccygeal vertebrae. So you can see that if we look at the cervical vertebrae, they are 7 in total, and they are all indistinguishable and similar to each other, with the exception of the first 2, which are very unique, C1 and C2. A lot of times you'll see the representation of the letter of the vertebrae and then the number where it is in sequence with the vertebral column. So you'll see C1 through C7. You'll see T1 through 12. That's thoracic because there's 12. L1 through L5. Just as you might see in the future in any documents or any anatomical literature or text. The first cervical vertebrae is known as the atlas, and it's similar to the mythology where Atlas is holding up the planet or the world. In this case, Atlas is holding up your head. The atlas, or C1, is the only one that doesn't have a body. Matter of fact, it is bodiless. And that's because the body technically is on C2, which is known as the axis. And by providing these facets and a bodiless atlas, or C1, this allows you to rotate your head and your skull in many different directions. It gives that flexibility and fluidity. And on C2, that's marked here in blue, that is the body, and it's also known as the dens, D-E-N-S, or the odontoid process. Cervical vertebrae are unmistakable in that they have what are known as transverse foramina. Now think about it. Transverse plane, right, cuts you in half, top to bottom, into your superior, inferior, and so it's on the kind of, you would think, as horizontal plane, and these are on the lateral portions of the cervical vertebrae, and they are depicted in these blue circles. They are on each lateral side of the cervical vertebra, and they hold some very essential nerves. As a matter of fact, if you gently hit or touch your neck, it's very sensitive. It's because there's lots of nerves that are running along the side of that, and you need to make room for them, and some of them actually go through, including blood vessels, capillaries, and veins, arteries, through and around this area of the transverse foramina to protect them. So anytime you see any vertebrae with transverse foramina, remember, foramen is a hole in bone and foramina is just plural, it's unmistakably a cervical vertebrae. It's that simple, very easy, even if you have that small fragment. As we move down inferior, the thoracic vertebrae, there are 12 because you have 12 ribs on each side. They have medium-sized bodies. They have really long spines, and you can see them as they project, even feel them on your back. And they have the facets and articulation areas for those ribs, and that also makes them unique and unmistakable. Lumbar vertebrae, they don't have very long spines, well, not as long as thoracic. They also do not have any of the facets or articulation centers that you would see with the connection with ribs. And the bodies of lumbar vertebrae are very, very large. You can see the sacrum here, not as separate vertebral segments, but completely fused together. That means that you're looking at an adult sacrum, or sacrovertebral, sacrovertebrae. And then you'll see the coccygeal vertebrae have been fused, and they're typically known as the coccyx. Sometimes they're separate. Sometimes all the coccygeal vertebrae are fused together. Sometimes they'll fuse directly to the sacrum. That is possible. That's just a part of human variation. This moves us to the thorax. Now, of course, we have part of the vertebral column, which is part of the thorax. And we're talking about the area which is typically known as the chest cavity. And it also, you can see that the pectoral girdle conjoins that. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So the thoracic vertebrae, all 12 of them, 12 ribs on each side. And you have the components of the sternum. Now, the sternum, as you can see, that are delineated, are three parts. So oftentimes you'll hear the word sternum used, but it's actually made of at least two bones and a piece of cartilage. You can see that there is a piece of bone, it can be bone or cartilage, that is on the most inferior aspect of the sternum. So understand that when you use the term sternum, you could be referring to at least three bones. You can see one that looks triangular in the most superior aspect, and that's known as the manubrium, M-A-N-U-B-R-I-U-M. And then you see the arrow that is marked with the sternum. This is typically known as the sternum body. And you can see little ripples in it and imperfections. That's because the sternum body, or corpus sternum, corpus meaning body, is made up of a number of different bones when you're a child, and it will fuse together, a bunch of different segments, and then fuse together to make the sternum body. And then the most inferior aspect, and this one shows a perforation, is known as the xiphoid process, Xiphoid. The xiphoid process oftentimes is cartilaginous, made of cartilage. Later in life, it may ossify and turn to bone. And matter of fact, each one of these bones, or pieces of cartilage, the manubrium, the sternum body, as well as the xiphoid process, may actually fuse into one bony amalgam as you get older, or there are some likely genetic and developmental variants that allow it to be one complete bone. But you should know that it is, matter of fact, 3 components if you're going to look at it in an osteological, anatomical sense. So those are the components of the thorax, and they make up part of your chest cavity, as well as 50% of your body weight, including your neck and head, that are above your pelvis. Now we have the pectoral girdle. Pectoral girdle, we have 2 of them. They are symmetric, and typically you're talking about the area that includes the clavicle, the scapula, and the area for the glenohumeral joint that articulates with the humerus, or your upper arm. So the scapula has a number of different components to it. We won't get into great detail. Some parts are very thin and friable. A lot of times this bone doesn't preserve very well in many contexts. You can see that the aspect, a process, I think it's the Chromian process, actually articulates with the lateral part of the clavicle, and then the medial part of the clavicle articulates with the manubrium. Now, there are some colloquial terms, like your shoulder blade for your scapula or your collarbone for your clavicle, but forget those. Not in osteology, those terms aren't necessarily used. The clavicle is probably one of the easiest bones for you to break in your body, besides your rib cage. It takes only a few pounds of pressure to do so, and that's why you'll see lots of collarbone injuries. At the same time, it is kind of tucked away on your shoulder, and it provides the ability for the scapula to be level with the superior aspect of your thorax. When the clavicle breaks, you'll see the scapula and the shoulder, the pectoral girdle, kind of droop a little bit. And so with the pectoral girdle, right, it's nice to divide things into segments, talk about the girdles like the pectoral girdle and the pelvic girdle, and then talk about the limbs that are attached to it. And we're going to talk about the forelimb next. Now that we've described the thorax and the pectoral girdle, we can talk about what articulates with them, and that is your forelimb. And it starts at the glenohumeral joint. The glenoid fossa is the groove on the scapula that makes room for the ball and socket joint of your humerus. And the humerus is the bone of your upper arm. And it contains the components to allow it to articulate again with the scapula, as well as in the distal portion with your radius and ulna. Your humerus is a very unique ball and socket joint in that you can move your humerus in all planes of the body simultaneous. It is a type of movement known as circumduction. And your torso can do this, your thorax, as well as your neck. But your femur and the socket for your femur that articulates with your pelvic girdle doesn't necessarily have this range of motion due to a number of different musculature as well as tendons. Although you might see some in Cirque du Soleil or ballet that has been able to stretch himself enough to create very close to that same type of range of motion. And so this is your forearm or your upper arm. It's known as the humerus. We can discuss what articulates with the humerus in the distal portion. That is your forearm or your lower arm, which is made of two bones, the radius and the ulna. In anatomical position, remember, anatomical position is where in an anterior view you're exposing the ventral part of your arm, meaning that the palms are facing anterior and your thumb or your pollex is pointed laterally. And that would mean your pinky fingers are medial. And when you are in anatomical position, the ulna is always medial and the radius is always lateral. Now, the movement based on the articulation centers with your forearm, if you move your forearm like you're doing bicep curls, you're moving almost exclusively your ulna and your radius is attached to it as part of your forearm. If you rotate your thumb so that it crosses over from lateral to medial, then you are doing what's known as pronating, and that is mostly movement with the radius. And so supination and pronation is another type of movement. Think about, holding up your hand and turning it to grab a bowl of soup. That's usually the way to remember supination. And pronation is just the opposite. And you can see it depicted at the elbow joint, both interior and posterior, for your viewing pleasure. And so those are the two bones that you need to be responsible for at the forearm. This moves us to the most distal portion of your arm, which is your hand. And your hand, when you think anatomically, is made up of a number of different components: carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Singular, that's phalanx. So no phalange. It's phalanx or phalanges. Your carpals are the set of bones, and there are 8 of them. You don't need to know: the scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, and capitate, as well as the hamate. They form 2 rows, kind of 4, and it is a way to articulate with your radius and ulna and make a hinge joint where your hand can flap up and down. And the metacarpals, they articulate with the carpals, and you have 5 of them because you have 5 digits and you're a mammal. Matter of fact, all mammals, with a few exceptions, have 5 digits on all of their terminal appendages. Your terminal forearm appendages have phalanges as well. And you have a total of, look at it. You have a total of 14. That's because you have 3 on 4 of the digits, 2 through 5, and then your pollex, which is the technical term for your thumb, only has 2 phalanges. That's why you'll see many anatomists talk about fingers and thumb being separate, that the thumb is not a finger. It's also opposable, unlike the rest of your terminal digits. So be aware of the components of the hand, not just what the name of the bones are, but the enumeration of them. That is, how many in number are there. We have finished the thorax, the pectoral girdle, and the forelimb. So now we'll move to the pelvic girdle and include the hind limb. your upper and lower leg, and then the terminal appendages, the most distal portion of your legs, which are your feet. Your pelvis is, you have two of them, so it's symmetric along the sagittal plane and midline. And your pelvis is three bones, including the ilium, ischium, and the pubis. The ilium is the one that you can feel laterally, right? That people will say, I'm a hip bone, usually, pointing to the ilium, specifically the iliac blade or crest. The ischium is always posterior, and the pubis is always anterior. And they fuse together during ontogeny or development to make the entire pelvic bone. Or os coxa is another term that you'll see used. C-O-X-A-E, or ox coxa, meaning singular, and the prefix os, os, meaning bone. And they all fuse together to make what's known as the acetabulum. The acetabulum is the cup or fossa for the femoral head, and this makes up your hip joint. It's a ball and socket joint that doesn't have as much flexibility as your glenohumeral joint or your neck or your torso, but it is one of the biggest fossa that you have for any joint surface or articulation center in your body. And you'll hear people talk about breaking their hip often. And oftentimes they break their femur, and I'll show you exactly where that occurs. But this is a summary of the pelvis. It articulates at the auricular surface of the pelvis, and that articulates with the sacrum. So you can see in the upper right hand corner, there are articulation centers with the sacrum, and then the two left and right pubis, they actually articulate anterior, and there is a pubic symphysis that's made of cartilage that separates them. Herein lies your femur. Your femur is the biggest bone in your body. It's also one of the densest bone, or the most dense. It's on par with the pars petrosa, or the petrous portion, which is on your temporal. And those are probably the two main bones that are sampled for things like radiocarbon dating, as well as extracting DNA, because it gets you the densest portion of bone. We'll talk about the components of bone once we get to things like growth and development. The femoral head is the articulation center, the ball and socket joint with the acetabulum on the pelvis. And you'll see the femoral neck. And this is where most people, when they say they broke their hip, oftentimes it's at the femoral neck. Most of the other bones, like the femoral head and the pelvis, are quite sturdy. But as you age, your bones become more brittle and they become more porous. And that femoral neck may buckle when you even use your body weight. Now, there are other landmarks you don't necessarily need to know, like the greater and lesser trochanter, but understand that the distal portion, you have these condyles, just like the mandibular condyle that articulates with your temporal bone, the inferior aspect of your temporal bone. The most distal portion of your femoral bone includes these condyles, which makes up the superior aspect of your knee joint. And of course, your kneecap or your knee bone is known as a patella, P-A-T-E-L-L-A. So we've got the components of the femur. The proximal aspect articulates with the pelvis. The distal aspect actually articulates with the tibia as well as the patella to form your knee joint. Now we have moved to your lower leg, which encompasses two bones. the tibia and the fibula. In anatomical position, the tibia is always medial and the fibula is always lateral. This is, unmistakable in anatomical position, as well as when you look at it from the onset. The tibia is a larger bone and the fibula is much skinnier. You'll notice that the tibia is known as colloquially the shin bone, and it probably is the most exposed bone in your body in terms of not having as much subcutaneous and cutaneous tissue when you look at it in comparison, because your epidermis, or your skin, it goes up right next to the anterior part of your tibia, or you feel it in your shin. This is where you have a lot of injuries. You will also see lots of healing on the tibia because of this. And the tibial plateau is the most proximal part of the tibia, and this makes up the inferior aspect of your knee joint. And those femoral condyles sit right on the tibial plateau to make another hinge joint where you can actually commit to flexion of your knee. The fibula and the tibia, when you move inferiorly or distally, each side forms, the parts of your ankle that you feel both laterally and medially. And they have what's known as a malleolus. And the malleolus on the tibia is medial. It's known as the medial malleolus. And then you have a lateral one that is on your fibula. And so this makes up the hinge joint that connects your lower leg, tibia and fibula, to the tarsal bones, in particularly the talus on your foot. And that's another hinge joint, just like your carpals articulating with the ulna and the radius. When we look at the terminal aspect of your hind limb appendage, we have the foot. And the foot, like your hand, is made up of three major types of bones, including the tarsals, metatarsals, and foot phalanges. So when you say phalanx or phalanges, you should also designate whether you are discussing the hand or the foot, and you use that before phalanges. Now, if you use pollex or hallux, an anatomist will know automatically you're talking about pollex, the thumb, or the hallux, the big toe. Now, if you look at our pollex, of course, is opposable to our hand, but the hallux is not in humans. Right? You can observe that the hallux is opposable in other non-human primates, apes, monkeys, and other little critters like lemurs and lorises and the tarsier. So when you look at our tarsal bones, you have 7 of them, and they're much larger than the carpal bones, including your calcaneus and the talus. Those are kind of the important ones to know. The talus is what articulates with your distal aspects of the fibula as well as the tibia. The calcaneus, colloquially, is known as your heel bone. And the tarsals are kind of clumped together in rows again that articulate with your metatarsals, which of course you have 5. And then you have a number of phalanges that total also up into 14, meaning you have 3 phalanges on all of your digits, 2 through 5, except the hallux, which only has 2. Some research has been done examining the pinky toe, the pinky phalanges, suggesting that one of them has been lost. So it was a study of maybe 1,000 or so individuals that demonstrate that most of them had only 2 phalanges on the pinky toe. So, just to show you that we may see variation and humans evolve. Humans are still evolving, and changing. And of course, what's the reason for the loss of the pinky toe? That's the why and the how. That's the hard question to answer. But this concludes our lecture on the postcranial skeleton, as well as our overview on human skeletal remains. You should now work on the next quiz as well as the lab to hone your skills.